sense of home. Where would I find that? If I go to the site, go to the website. It may be whispered. Troubleshooting purposes, be wise. Now it still says, it says here, it says the channel is not live. Otherwise, it's not. So it won't tell me the number until I get on. Until you launch.
All right, everyone. Oh, I got to stand at the podium so I can be properly recorded and broadcast throughout the world. All right. Welcome, everyone. I'm Rusty Lino, and I'm the editor of First Things magazine. And it's really my pleasure to co-sponsor this seminar, three-day seminar, on the thought of Dietrich von Hildebrand. Am I right about that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I have to say. Wait a minute, did they change the topic on me? It would be appropriate for the Dietrich von Hildebrand Legacy Project. And John Henry is working, putting this on. I'm really grateful that you've chosen this venue for the seminar. I do hope that those of you who have not read, don't read First Things magazine, would use this visit to our office as an opportunity to take a free copy of the magazine and fall in love with it, as have many others. I do hope. So welcome, everyone. And again, I'm really gratified that you all could join into this seminar, and I hope to be able to join in later in the week, at a later stage. And don't forget the lecture tomorrow night. What time is it?
6 p.m.
6 p.m. 6 p.m. lecture on Tuesday. So again, welcome.
Thank you. Rusty, thank you.
Thank you very much, Rusty. My name is John Henry Crosby. I'm the founder and director of the Hildebrand Legacy Project. The first time I came to see Father Newhouse, which was at the old offices, I went into the room and there was this sort of double take, and it was clear he thought that he was meeting with my father, slightly older John Crosby, but it was a great first meeting. He was very generous. So I just want to thank you, Rusty, for hosting this seminar. This is not the first collaboration with First Things in the Hildebrand Project, but it's the first public collaboration. We've worked together on some private roundtables, and we'll continue doing that. But I'm very grateful. I'm also grateful to all of the First Things staff and fellows who've been helpful. I just want to say a quick word before introducing the presenter of the seminar, and I'll save a few announcements for the end. Rusty already mentioned this lecture we have tomorrow. I'll just perhaps say that, just so that that doesn't go under, that the title of the lecture is The Forgotten Voice of von Hildebrand, be given by my father, and the great aim of it is to connect von Hildebrand's thought to the great issues of the day, and so to speak, offer Hildebrand's ideas up close. I have to say it's an honor to be collaborating with First Things. First Things is truly the undisputed leader, I think, in the promotion of searching and thoughtful dialogue on questions of ultimate importance over the, I think, more than 2 decades now that it's been doing this. But the partnership is appropriate because the commitment of First Things is also very much definitive or defining of von Hildebrand, which is this attempt to return constantly to philosophical and first principles in the consideration of issues. So whereas our culture reduces questions of ethics to sociology, questions of aesthetics to marketing, I suppose, publication like First Things, the work of von Hildebrand, are committed to, so to speak, allowing these realities not to be reduced beyond recognition. So in von Hildebrand's case, this is remarkable that, for example, when he was caught up in the heat of battle in writing vehemently against Hitler in the 1930s, or when making the case for the validity of sacred tradition in the 60s, and the confusion following Vatican II, He always remained true to his identity as a philosopher and addressing the issues of the day in light of the permanent things. I had the privilege, as perhaps others of you will, of exchanging quite a number of emails and even some letters with Father Newhouse in his last years. I got to know him only at the end of his life. He was always unfailingly kind, he was receptive, he was encouraging. The smallest countries in the world. And then on our return to the United States, my father was appointed professor of philosophy at Franciscan University of Steubenville, where he's been and continues to be, was the founding and again chairman of the MA program in philosophy. Now, I have to give special credit to the fact that my business card says founder and director, but my father is truly the co-founder of the Hildebrand Project, along with Alison Hildebrand and others. And it's been absolutely sort of at the very center of our work of shaping our mission. He's the senior editor of all of our translations. Recently, the Board of Trustees of the Legacy Project appointed him our first senior fellow, and the purpose of that is a kind of, you might say, investment in our intellectual infrastructure so that the work that he does can be given greater visibility and also the acknowledgement that it's due. So without further ado, I will now turn it over to you, Dr. Crosby. And we'll, just one thing, we will take a break about halfway through the seminar. We'll take maybe 15 minutes, so you can be back in your seats in 10 or 15 minutes at the start of the break. That would be appreciated. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Crosby.
Thank you, John Henry. A lot of young men go to work for their fathers, you know, but with us it's the other way around. I'm working here for my son. There's actually one point of indebtedness to von Hildebrand that John Henry neglected to mention. It was through von Hildebrand that I met my wife. So without him, John Henry would not exist. So,
And no legacy project.
And no legacy project. So, I welcome you all to this seminar, a seminar in which I've been asked to focus especially on the fundamental philosophical ideas of von Hildebrand. Tomorrow night in the lecture at 6 o'clock here, I'll speak about von Hildebrand in a more comprehensive way, as a man of faith, as a witness, and not just as a philosopher. But today the idea is to capture what is significant and original about him as philosopher. So my idea is to talk maybe never more than about 20 minutes at a run, and then to pause and take your questions and reactions. I think That's the only listener-friendly way to conduct this seminar. Let me begin by, reminding you of the title of today's. There are 3 meetings of this seminar, and today it is on the place of Dietrich von Hildebrand within the Judeo-Christian Intellectual Tradition, or simply within Western philosophy. And my talk is going to be primarily about von Hildebrand as phenomenologist. That was his primary philosophical identity. I want to explain that to you and show how, through that phenomenological formation, he found a path to the heart of the Christian intellectual tradition. Now, he began his philosophy studies in Munich in 1906, at the age of 17. And while studying in Munich, he heard of the groundbreaking work that was being done by Edmund Husserl. Some of you may know Husserl as the founder of so-called phenomenology in 20th century philosophy. And what von Hildebrand heard fascinated him, and he moved from Munich to Göttingen in Germany, where Husserl was professor. And there in Göttingen, his teachers were the great Edmund Husserl, but also the, in his own way, equally great Max Scheler, a major figure in the early days of phenomenology. Now, von Hildebrand, therefore, was formed philosophically in that first circle of phenomenologists who gathered around Husserl in Göttingen in the first decade of the 20th century. Von Hildebrand was one of them. And even after his conversion to Catholicism in 1914, he never put into question or fundamentally changed this phenomenological orientation of his philosophy. This is in contrast, for instance, with a convert of about the same time, Jacques Maritain, who on converting felt an obligation somehow to recast himself as a Thomistic philosopher. But von Hildebrand did not feel any such obligation. And so if we're going to understand him as philosopher, we need to understand what these phenomenological roots of his thought are. Now, you may at first be a little put off by the mention of von Hildebrand as phenomenologist, because you think, if you know just a little bit about von Hildebrand, that he was a zealous defender of the objectivity of truth, the objectivity of morality, and you may think phenomenology, isn't that one of these modern schools of thought infected by subjectivism? How could the likes of von Hildebrand ever have come out of that philosophical background? Well, as we will see, the so-called phenomenology represented by Husserl in these years, by Max Scheler, the 2 great teachers of von Hildebrand, was utterly opposed to subjectivism. One of the things that drew von Hildebrand to Husserl and Scheler was just the fact that they were very powerful critics of subjectivism. And by the way, I might mention here Edith Stein, whose name you all know. Edith Stein had exactly the same philosophical education that von Hildebrand had. She had exactly the same teachers, and she too, after her conversion, felt no need to repudiate her phenomenological identity. So, what did von Hildebrand understand by phenomenology? What did he mean when he embraced this identity of himself as philosophers? It's a very difficult question. People often, students sometimes will ask me, now Dr. Crosby, give it to me just in a few short sentences, a definition of phenomenology. And I always say, it can't be done. It just can't be done in a few sentences. It's not an easy thing. But I think in the approach I'm about to take, I can maybe give you a for the distinctive way of philosophizing that was von Hildebrand's and comes out of phenomenology. Let's maybe start with a famous slogan or battle cry of his teacher Husserl. Husserl said, "Zurück zu den Sachen selbst," that is, back to the things themselves. And so that expresses the idea of a kind of philosophy that returns to the primordial sources of experience and philosophizes out of that experience. Now, you may say that's still a little vague, just what you mean here by phenomenology. This is what I think will explain it to you. I want to show how von Hildebrand, as phenomenological philosopher, practiced what I will call an anti-reductionism. Now, by reductionism, I mean one of those philosophies that says something is nothing but. You see, so it would be a reductionist philosophy to say the mind and its conscious life is nothing but brain function. Or to say with Freud, the love between man and woman is nothing but sublimated sexual desire. That nothing but is the signature of reductionistic philosophy. And we'll get, I think, right into the genius and spirit of phenomenology if we look at the anti-reductionistic way that von Hildebrand philosophized. In other words, I want to try to show how von Hildebrand, by turning back to our experience, lets things show themselves for what they are and doesn't cut them short, staple and mutilate them, but avoids all kinds of reductionism. So I've got today's presentation organized under the heading of 5 lines of anti-reductionist thinking in von Hildebrand. Let's see if all those 5 taken together don't give you a sense of him as phenomenology and give you a feel for the particular style of his thought. Now, let's take as a first specimen of reductionism, something that von Hildebrand often dealt with, and I just mentioned, namely the idea that the conscious life of a person is nothing but brain function. Now, the phenomenologist says, let's consult the things themselves. Let's look closely and see if conscious experiencing really does present itself as nothing but neurons and firing across synapses. And von Hildebrand then, consulting the things themselves, notices that the conscious experiencing of a person is not, for instance, say to a surgeon who has a patient there on the table. The surgeon is looking through the folds of the patient's brain. Von Hildebrand says, look, the surgeon will never see, not even if he has powerful instruments of magnification, anything that would be the conscious life of the patient. And even if the patient is conscious for the surgery, as sometimes happens in this surgery, nothing that the doctor can possibly see would really be, literally be, a part of the conscious life of the patient. And on the other hand, the patient, for his part, in his own conscious experiencing, does not experience any trace of synapses and neurons and blood flow and lobes of the brain. Not a trace of any of that turns up in the conscious experiencing of the patient. And so von Hildebrand says, look, the doctor, the brain surgeon, is looking at the brain there as an object of his perception. But the conscious experiencing of the patient is something in the patient as subject. It's something experienced only from within by the patient as subject. And therefore, it's not accessible when the doctor looks at the brain as object. And on the other hand, that inner experiencing from within can't access all of those parts of the brain. And so, von Hildebrand concludes, it makes no sense to reduce conscious experiencing to brain function. A respectful listening to the things themselves shows that we have two incommensurable realms here, with the biology of brain function on the one hand and this interiority of conscious experiencing on the other. Now, they're clearly causally connected. That's the core of truth in what the reductionist says. They're causal connections between brain function and conscious life. But the idea of identifying our conscious experiencing with brain function is, so the phenomenologists argue, a preposterous reductionism. You don't have just brain function. You've got this irreducible thing of conscious experiencing with its inwardness and subjectivity, its accessibility only from the inside by the person whose conscious life it is. So that's a first example of phenomenology trying to lay hold of and demolish a well-known reductionistic move in philosophy. Take that as a first example of it. I'll give one more and then take our first break for questions so that I don't wear you out with too much continuous talking. Here's an example that the phenomenologists and von Hildebrand too often speak about when they talk about reductionism. According to one reductionist view, the real reality of colors, the color qualities that we see, the real reality are light waves. And now, not many would go so far as to say there's nothing but light waves and no seen color qualities. But many say that, look, the main reality here are the light waves. If you want to see what's really going on in the world, forget about those color qualities. That's just subjective, private impressions that doesn't count for anything. The real reality of the world are these light waves. Now, when phenomenologists examine this, looking closely at our experience of color qualities, they come to the conclusion that these color qualities, especially if you consider the aesthetic potential of the color qualities and the color contrasts, these color qualities have a tremendously rich qualitative being. And it's in no way the case that they're just subjective private impressions that pale into insignificance compared to the physics of light waves. On the contrary, the phenomenologist says the light waves do their work by making it possible for color qualities to appear in our experience. But when those color qualities appear, a new world opens. You can't reduce that simply to the underlying light waves, or discredit it as if the only reality here were that of the light waves. And you notice an interesting thing about phenomenology here with this issue of color qualities, and by the way, the same point can be made with regard to sounds, heard sounds in their relation to sound waves. But the interesting thing is that phenomenology, as practiced by von Hildebrand and all the great phenomenologists, takes very seriously the world of our experience. It's not in the business of debunking and discrediting what we experience, but rather of understanding it. You see, the reductionistic philosophies always somehow debunk. They say, oh, you had taken consciousness to be something significant, or color and sounds to be something significant. Or let me tell you, there's really not much to them. But this respect for our experience of being, and this intention to understand it rather than discredit it, is very characteristic for the philosophical of von Hildebrand, and he learned it in the school of phenomenology. All right, that gets us started. That's 2 of the 5 specimens of phenomenological anti-reductionism that I wanted to show you, and perhaps already now we could take some questions. Yeah, please.
Professor,
Alex.
I may be getting too far ahead, but I'm curious if there is something that's unique to von Hildebrand's approach in contrast to earlier phenomenologists or his teachers. Is there some unique contribution or unique emphasis on his part?
Yeah. Yeah, well, there are certain areas, and I'll be talking about those, in which he applied this phenomenological respect for things and this phenomenological skill in letting things show themselves. He makes certain singular contributions in certain areas using that method, and I'll come to that in a bit. Please, please.
Recently I heard at the graduation ceremony a group of engineers say that now that they have devised a computer that actually beat the best world champion in chess.
Yes.
You know, he's been defeated. They've now defeated a human being with this machine.
Yeah.
Is this trend in the development of this computer world, would you consider that a reductionist view of?
Yeah. Well, just so long you don't think that, what was the famous computer, Deep Blue, that defeated all the chess champions, just so long you don't think Deep Blue has any conscious understanding, then, you know, we have to bow before its great power in playing chess. But the computer has no conscious life. It's an instrument that prolongs the conscious powers of the makers, but the computer itself isn't consciously awakened. And that blunder is easily committed, to think that there's some deep thinker here produced through the computer. But in fact, in terms of conscious life, the computer is dead. It is, you know, a product of the conscious makers. But when it makes a move, it's not as if there's anyone understanding the point of the move.
Are the makers of these, the design them, are they do they believe they have consciousness?
Well, they do, and undoubtedly
That was
the
really
makers
what I
do.
wondered.
And of course, with technology, they're probably not very good chess players themselves, but with the power of technology, their ability to find the right move is greatly enhanced.
So this would be this would be a movement, a contemporary movement that would be.
Right, insofar as one blurs the difference between a conscious mind and a functioning computer, then you've got the same reductionism at work. One has to say the really distinguishing thing about consciousness is this inwardness, the interiority of the experiencing person. There is no conscious inwardness, not in the most powerful computer. So, yeah, that's an interesting application of the first example. Yeah, anything else? Yeah, please.
Excuse me, Dr. Crosby. Could you go into a little bit why the phenomenologist is able to say that the computer is, as you say, dead or inert?
Yeah.
If a philosopher from another time, say a Thomist or an Aristotelian, might give a reason for that is based on deduction or based on analytical reasoning. A phenomenologist would be describing what's in front of him in a different way. Could you perhaps go into what makes the phenomenologist approach to that unique, especially from von Hildebrand's point of view?
Yeah. It's let me go back to my own grammar school education. We didn't have computers. We worked with slide rules. I don't know if anybody remembers the slide rules that were used, and you could get to perform operations there, effortlessly, but would have been very laborious to work out. No, one has to say the slide rule doesn't have any intelligence. It's intelligently designed so that if I use it in a certain way, I get my answer much faster. And I would want to say Deep Blue has no more consciousness than a slide rule has. In both cases, they are certain prolongations of human intelligence, but they're not inhabited by any conscious life of their own. The computer no more than the slide rule. And so the idea is that, that conscious understanding of why something is so, that's not, as a conscious event, proper to the computer. It lies all in the makers of it. And so, the computer has certainly an ability to simulate certain operations of the mind and simulate them in a way that lets us get our results much faster than we could otherwise get them. But that doesn't bring into being a new center of inwardness, and a new center that can say I, and really be there as a conscious person. You're both, though, very rightly updating this issue of reductionism, bringing it into the digital age with the drift of your questions. Yeah. Anything else on that? Yeah, please.
I can, well, my thesis is that C.S. Lewis was a phenomenologist.
Yeah.
And I could give you an example, I don't know, might help, of from children's literature. I was always a snob and never wanted anything to do with children's literature, but I have to say that I think children's literature like youth is wasted on the young. Yeah. And in one of the incidents in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, which is from Narnia, it's Eustace, who is very modern, calls his mother and father by their first names. There's all kinds of scientific things and so on. He's talking to Ramandu, and he says, in my world, a star is a fiery ball of gas. And Ramandu answers him and says, that's what a star is made of, not what a star is.
Yeah.
So you could write a whole thesis just on
Yeah.
one sentence.
Yeah, right.
You know.
Yeah, that's a vintage piece of reductionism,
Right.
a fiery ball of gas. All right, let me then move on. I'm going to attempt now a third specimen of anti-reductionism. Now this is taken from Husserl himself. It made a tremendous impression on von Hildebrand. And I think I can say it in a way that will be readily accessible. Husserl was in debate with a philosophic position dominant at the end of the 19th century called psychologism. And in particular, he was in debate with psychologism as a theory of logic. And here's what psychologism said about logic. It said, the laws of logic are simply laws that describe human mental capacity. So, for instance, the elementary law of logic that contradictory propositions can't both be true. Well, according to psychologism, that just meant that you and I can't believe contradictory propositions. Just try it. You believe something, now try to believe the contradictory opposite. You can't do it. And so the idea of psychologism was, it's just a limit on human thinking. That believing one thing, you can't at the same time also believe the contradictory opposite. It's sort of like the psychological law, you know, that you and I can't think about many different things with full attention at the same time. Maybe God and angels can, but we can't. You know, the attention to one thing diverts us away from other things. And so the idea was, well, the principle of contradiction is just like that. It just sort of describes a kind of limit in our mental powers, telling us what we human beings, constituted as we are, can and can't think. And Husserl was famous for the devastating criticism of psychology in logic. And he argued, look, when you have contradictory propositions and you say they can't both be true, well, that's not just for us human beings, because we can't think that they're both true. It doesn't matter whether the contradictory propositions are entertained by angels, by God himself. They can't both be true. It has nothing to do with human psychology. And so Husserl argued that logic, this ancient philosophic discipline that deals with truth and validity, is irreducible to human psychology. It's not distinctively human in its basic laws and principles. Husserl made the very penetrating argument. He said, look, now, one person may find it difficult if he believes one thing to believe the contradictory opposite. But what about the case where one person disagrees with another? Then you've got contradictory positions, and there's no psychological hindrance at all, because you've got two different people disagreeing with each other. But isn't it true that contradictory propositions exclude each other just as much when two people disagree as when one person tries to hold contradictory opposites? So the point is, the law really, the rightly understood law of contradiction and all the other laws of logic really don't describe distinctively human psychology at all. they have a much greater transhuman validity. And therefore, we have to say that logic, this philosophy of truth and validity, is irreducible to empirical psychology. Now, that argument of Husserl's had an enormous impact, and in a way, phenomenology originates out of that debate of Husserl with psychologism. But what I mainly want you to see is the reductionism of psychologism and the anti-reductionism of the Husserlian critique. There's a very touching passage in von Hildebrand's memoirs where he's talking about his student days. And he says that he was sitting there in the English gardens in Munich, his home, reading just this passage in the logical, and the great work of Husserl called The Logical Investigation, reading just this passage against psychologism. And he said, as he was sitting there reading, it was in fact spring. And there were trees with buds on them and flowers first coming out there in the English gardens. And von Hildebrand said, I thought to myself, Husserl is initiating a new springtime in philosophy with this anti-reductionism. So that I would offer as a third specimen of the anti-reductionism. That's maybe the most challenging one, the one pitched at the highest level of abstraction. But you see that psychologism was a highly subjectivistic philosophy because it implied that, well, the principle of contradiction just holds for us human beings. Who knows whether it holds for other beings? So its validity was altogether relative to the peculiarities of human psychological life. But Husserl somehow salvaged a more universal and absolute importance for the principle of contradiction by showing how it was irreducible to the standard psychologistic interpretation. All right. Here's a fourth specimen of anti-reductionism in the phenomenological spirit. And this is one taken from von Hildebrand's own writings. Freud held that the love between man and woman is nothing but sublimated sexual desire. The nothing but signals the reductionism. Now, Hildebrand, turning back to the things themselves, trying to recover a deeper experience of the love between man and woman, argues like this. He says, now, all love, we have his great treatise on love. I don't know if John Henry put it out, but we translated it and published it just a couple of years ago, one of his major works in philosophy. He argues all love, including the love between man and woman, is born of some experience of the goodness and the beauty of the beloved person. So love for another is full of reverence for the other, full of affirmation of the other in his or her beauty, full of a serious interest in the real good of the other. This, he argues, is the structure of all love, including the love between man and woman. Now, to view another person simply as an object of sexual consumption, simply as gratifying my sexual desire, is utterly opposed to the genius of love. It is not the very essence of love, as Freud claimed. Now, it's true that there is a sexual consummation of the love between man and woman in marriage, but in this case, von Hildebrand argues, sexual energy is incorporated into real love. Beloved, having this reverence for the beloved and this concern for the real well-being of the beloved. Incorporated into that love so that the sexual energy provides for a unique bodily expression and enactment of the love. But the sexuality doesn't replace the love or constitute its very essence, as Freud claimed. And so there, von Hildebrand is saying to Freud, you don't have to bring in any religious faith. All you have to do is look more closely at the things themselves. And there you can see that what Freud describes is a real possibility in human beings, but through its consuming, using nature, is not love. And that it becomes quite transformed and incorporated into the love between man and woman. There's another example from Freud that I've noticed in my own work that von Hildebrand made some mention of, and that is, Freud has the idea that what we call conscience is nothing but what Freud calls the superego, the internalized parental voice. That's all that sense of responsibility is that we have in a solemn moment of conscience. And I've tried to show that that piece of reductionism doesn't work, and that the real thing of this moral inwardness, this sense of responsibility, is altogether irreducible to the internalized parental voice. But I won't expand on that since it's not directly one of von Hildebrand's main examples of anti-reductionism. But I will just point out that this anti-reductionism leads into something else in von Hildebrand that's very, very characteristic for him as philosopher, and that is his personalism. He's often called a kind of personalist, like Max Scheler was called a personalist. And you can see how you need this anti-reductionist way of philosophizing about human beings in order to capture them as persons. If free will is nothing but, some drive or instinct, then love is nothing but, and all the distinctly personal achievements are nothing but something lower, then you've eliminated the person. So the personalism of von Hildebrand tries to do particular justice to human beings as persons, relies very much on this anti-reductionism that he learned through his phenomenological formation. Now, we can pause here too. That's already now 4. 5 specimens of anti-reductionism. The 5th is a longer story, so I'll see what there is here. Yeah, please, did you?
No.
Yeah, please, Phil.
Professor, you mentioned the word reverence,
Yeah.
and in my limited reading of von Hildebrand, that's one of the concepts that most attracted me.
Yes.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about
Oh, yeah, that's, he calls it in one place the mother of all virtues. You know, this reverence. And I hadn't thought about it before, but when you raise the question right now when I'm talking about phenomenology, you could say that phenomenology at its best is a certain disciplined way of practicing reverence in our attempts to know the world. You know, the abstaining from the facile reductionisms and reverently letting things show themselves for what they are. There's definitely a connection between reverence and the real phenomenological spirit as I'm trying to capture it. But, you know, and has a wonderful discussion in his little book, Fundamental Moral Attitudes. 5 basic moral attitudes, and the first is reverence, and it's something that he had a very deep understanding, and he realized how, you know, without reverence, there's a great deal, especially in the moral life, that you just never understand. It's not even accessible to you if you approach it in a kind of arrogant, know-it-all spirit. There's a large part of the true face of the world, and Hildebrand would say, that shows itself only to a really reverent person. So that need for reverence really to develop one's moral and aesthetic understanding too is very strongly stressed by him. He has beautiful things also on the virtue of chastity, and makes a particular point on the need for approaching the sexual sphere with a certain reverence in order to capture the mysterious intimacy that characterizes it. Yeah?
Just to follow on the same question, because I've been intrigued by the notion of reverence for a while, and also Alice von Hildebrand has been writing about reverence.
Oh, yes, right.
I'm just wondering, to what extent has this particular idea been picked up by other phenomenologists? I'm thinking of Gabriel Marcel's idea of mystery.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, I wouldn't include Karl Wojtyławicz strictly as a phenomenologist, so I wouldn't necessarily want to go in that direction. But among the other phenomenologists that we can think of, is this something fairly unique to von Hildebrand, or is this something?
Well, he certainly shared it with Max Scheler.
Yeah.
There's a beautiful essay of Scheler's on reverence and humility. And so I don't know whether he has it from Scheler or Scheler had it from him. They influenced each other very strongly over a period of years. But certainly the great Scheler is a figure to be mentioned here. And you're right, Marcel, you know, distinguishes problem and mystery, is certainly thinking of reverence there. That's what sensitizes us to the mystery of things. Yeah. Yeah, please.
Just to develop your third point a little bit, I think it's one of the aspects of Husserl that not only for human beings do we operate in on the truth level of non-contradiction, but there's also this level of coherence that human discourse has to really achieve to really be human language. Is something more than just simply X is not X or something like that. Right. But there is this level of coherence and distinctness and moving beyond the mere vagueness. And I was wondering, because there seems to be kind of a reductionism also in I guess some analytic philosophies of language and things like that. I was wondering if phenomenology has, it seems to be, it can be taken in that direction of a philosophy of language as well. I was wondering if there's any of that in
well, he didn't write a philosophy of language, although we often taught the course, and we have in the Literary Remains some very interesting unpublished papers in philosophy of language. But there too, like Husserl, he was very interested in the fact that many structures of language, like the structure of a proposition, or that is not just a peculiarity of human thinking. There's something more fundamental and more universal than just the distinctively human at work in many, many structures of language. So that's, I know there's another great phenomenologist working now, Robert Sokolovsky at Catholic University of America, who has written extensively in the philosophy of language, right along this phenomenological line.
Yeah, that's what kind of prompted my question.
Uh-huh.
It seems to be a good kind of development of those themes there.
Right.
Present in Hildebrand.
Exactly. That's the best phenomenological philosophy of language I know, the one developed by Sokolovsky. And it's profoundly akin to von Hildebrand's own work. Von Hildebrand didn't stay in logic. You know, he, being more of a personalist, was primarily interested in the human person and man and woman and other issues of ethics, as we'll see in the next meeting. Yeah, please.
Just as a point of information, what caused the break between Husserl and von Hildebrand?
You know, that's a mysterious thing. There was, of course, von Hildebrand's conversion in 1914.
But Edith Stein.
But Edith Stein also converted. You know, there were, von Hildebrand thought, certain dangerous subjectivist tendencies in Husserl's much later work. And that caused a certain critical distance and a cooling of the personal relation. Perhaps that would be... It was nothing like a break or a bitter estrangement.
No, but they went their separate ways.
They went very different ways, and that was partly behind it. Now, Christopher, time-wise, are we about halfway through? I didn't know.
We're just about an hour into it.
About an hour into it. All right. Then we're going to take a 15-minute break.
Okay.
About halfway through. Let's see if there are any other questions right on people's minds. We'll catch them while they're
I hope it doesn't
alive.
take so long, but,
Please, please.
it seems like on your discussion about reduction that people do, that it conceals, that it doesn't allow the full nature of something to be seen, and like we see this, I think, in human culture in general now, where we conceal, and that causes a degradation of human dignity. So a woman is not just an actual person that God loves or that's supposed to, you know, live in a certain way, but they're just animals, or they're supposed to, and there's those certain tendencies there, and do you think that's right?
Oh, absolutely. I think whatever obscures the human being as person is reductionistic, and that phenomenology, therefore, when it's practiced well, overcomes that reductionism. Man is nothing but, an ape with a higher IQ, or an ape who's learned to make tools. The nothing but there is, destructive of a real personalism, and that's why I was saying that one needs this this phenomenological habit of letting things show themselves for what they are, in order to let human beings appear as persons, as centers of freedom, standing between good and evil, and open to the absolute. All of that requires a certain anti-reductionism. Yes, Christopher.
I have a question from one of our online viewers. Which you might be able to answer. Eric of Manchester asks, juxtaposed to the anti-reductionist, would you say that phenomenology's domain is the intimate knowledge of things unseen and their hierarchy of being and value?
The intimate knowledge of things unseen. Well, maybe not necessarily unseen, but the intimate knowledge of things easily overlooked, easily folded into something else. So there's that that attempt to vindicate, you might say, significant. We're going to see, when we look a little more at von Hildebrand on man and woman, a case where something about man and woman easily overlooked is retrieved by him thanks to his phenomenological approach. Yeah, so yeah, obviously you wouldn't have the reductionism in the first place if there weren't something, you know, somehow hidden. So that creates the danger of reductionism. Something very significant that doesn't just jump off the page at you. It has a certain hiddenness, yes. So I think the questioner is on to something there. And I thank question. But let's maybe take our 15 or so minute break. It's maybe with the air conditioning out here. It's perhaps doubly needed. They say it'll be back tomorrow. So
It's not functioning.
what's that?
It's not functioning.
No, it's not functioning.
Okay. They're not just trying to torture us.
Well, it challenges me all the more to keep your interest. So let's see. We have now, Christopher. It's 4:05. Let's resume at 4:20.
Okay.
All right, so perhaps rather than making any announcements at the end, I'm just going to take this moment to make a few quick announcements right now, and then we'll resume with the seminar. So our host, Rusty Reno, graciously encourages everyone here who's not a First Things subscriber to pick up the issue of First Things and consider becoming one, but perhaps I can more directly pitch you all on that, because after all, I'm not pitching my own work, but I can only, for those of you who don't, I imagine everyone here is aware of First Things, or perhaps even a subscriber, but of course it's truly the magazine of note in intellectual discourse of the sort that we're having here, and so I can only encourage you to do this. Also, of course, First Things is not only sustained by its subscriptions, but also by donations, so it's important to remember that First Things is not only a publication that advances important ideas, but it's truly a part of the intellectual infrastructure of a certain brand of Orthodox Christianity and Judaism. So I think it's very important that we, if only for those reasons, support its continuation. Let me note this. The seminar does not take place tomorrow, as I think some of you perhaps have thought. It skips a day tomorrow and then continues on Wednesday and finishes Thursday, and that is because tomorrow we have the public lecture on von Hildebrand entitled The Forgotten Voice of Dietrich von Hildebrand, also given by my father, that will take place in this very room. You're all welcome to attend, but so as to avoid having the two back-to-back, there will be no seminar tomorrow. So please, if you do come tomorrow, you'll have to wait a few hours and then you can attend the talk, but perhaps best to not to do that. One other thing, I think most of you know that the readings for the seminar are online, but let me just call your attention to that. They're available on our website, hildebrandlegacy.org. Obviously, they're not meant to be required, but it's sort of more readings designed to enrich your participation, so I would encourage those to you. We have a book table in the back. It will be slightly larger beginning tomorrow. There's a price list. They're all reduced in price, so help yourself, please. We're just going to maybe take the approach of an honor system, since we don't have someone working the table. So if you're interested in a book, take it. I'll even trust you to take the book and simply make a donation on our website if that's easier. So we want to make sure you help yourself to those if you're interested. Our website does also, our online bookstore has many more titles if that's of interest to you as well, although these are all somewhat reduced beyond that. I want to make one brief announcement for another partner organization that we work with. That's the Museum of Biblical Art, known as MOBIA. They're based on Broadway, just north of Columbus Circle, and the Legacy Project has collaborated with them on a number of occasions, and they have the opening of a very important exhibit this Thursday called The Adoration of the Magi. It's the reconstruction of a great, I think it's a triptych by Bartolo di Fredi, one of the great Sienese Renaissance masters. This will be the first time that this triptych is, I think, together in perhaps 3 centuries. Maybe even longer. So in any case, their grand opening is on Thursday of this evening. You're all welcome to attend. The Legacy Project continues its, and by the way, the brochures are on the back table, so please take one if you're interested in the opening. The Legacy Project will be collaborating with MOBIA next Tuesday. I believe that the event is at this point sold out, but it is viewable on the internet and live streaming, as all of this is now, and that will be an evening with Dana Gioia, the former chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts. Some of you perhaps know him as one of the most effective promoters of the importance of art, but not art in a sort of decorative sense, but art in a profound and transforming way. And Dana will speak on the topic, Not by Bread Alone, Why Beauty is Not a Luxury but a Human Necessity. And so this will be, in fact, a talk given in interview format, so very informal. He'll be interviewed by Roberta Amundsen, who some of you may know, the chair of Mobius board, and then I'm sure there will be questions from the audience. So I would encourage you all at least to participate online. And if anyone is terribly interested in attending, you can talk to me and maybe I can slip you in the back door. So that again is next Tuesday, June 12th. So with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Dr. Crosby. The one thing I would perhaps ask is if anyone has any telephones on, perhaps turn them off, including the presenter, Professor Crosby. They're loud enough here, and they're really loud for those viewing online. You're, by the way, joined by about, I think, 70 live viewers. So it's
Many from Europe?
Many from Europe, from South America. So we have a
very international audience.
International audience. So, anyways, welcome to all of you, especially also our virtual viewers. I hope you'll join us for the rest of this week. So, thank you.
And we might encourage the virtual viewers to submit questions, as some have already. They, listening in from wherever they are, should be full participants in the discussion. All right, so we have then these different cases of reductionistic philosophy, the phenomenological response. So the reductionisms have been the reduction of consciousness to brain function, then of light and sound qualities to light and sound waves. Then we looked at the reduction of logic to psychology, the great issue that launched Husserl on his career. And then, fourthly, the Freudian case of reducing the love between man and woman to merely sublimated sexual desire. Now I come to a fifth case that has a particular importance in understanding phenomenology in general and von Hildebrand in particular. This is a reductionism that comes out of natural science. And it's not proper to natural science as such, but it arises when natural science makes certain exclusivist claims. Now, what I have in mind is this. Many claim that all the laws governing reality are discovered by the different natural sciences. What cannot be known by natural science cannot be known at all. And that was one of the appeals of psychologism as a theory of logic, that it subjected logic to natural science. You know how today, for instance, ethics is subject to evolutionary biology. Or I've just noticed this Journal of Happiness Studies, where people on a scale of 1 to 10 say how happy they feel about something, and the results are tabulated. And philosophy has nothing to say, apparently. It's all the empirical sociologist. So the idea is that really well-founded knowledge about the structure and law governing things comes not from philosophy, but rather from these natural sciences or empirical sciences. Now, once again, phenomenology, with this return to the things themselves, issues a challenge to this reductionism, that there is, let's say, let's define it like this, no law of the world not established by the empirical methods of the natural sciences. Now, Husserl, in his great work, I mentioned it already, The Logical Investigations, has a very significant passage. It's not easy to read, but this is the gist of it. He develops a general theory of parts and wholes. And he notices that certain things are not just juxtaposed with each other, but are in fact inseparable from each other, and that they therefore form a very strong kind of whole. And his example is this: the color quality of a thing is inseparable from some extension in space. If the color quality can't spread out in some space, it can't exist as a color quality. Or an interesting variation on that example, a musical melody can't exist except as spread out in time. If there's no temporal extension, there's no possibility for the thing that we call a musical melody. Von Hildebrand, thinking about things inseparable from one another like this, commonly used this example of moral qualities like reverence and justice and all the other moral qualities are only possible in a person. If a being isn't a person, then the being is not the kind of thing that could possibly bring moral values into the world. Now, the phenomenologist and following Husserl noticed that this inseparability, say, of color and spatial extension, we can express it like this: it's essentially impossible to have color without spatial extension. It's essentially impossible to have moral excellences, or for that matter, moral vices, without a person as the subject of them. And Husserl marveled at the fact that this is a kind of rational insight of the mind, whereby we see what is essentially impossible, one thing essentially impossible without something else. And here is the cutting edge against that absolutized approach of natural science. Husserl said, look, by making many observations, like seeing a patch of color, it's extended in space, by seeing that repeated many times, you still don't reach the thing that we in fact possess, namely the rational insight into the impossibility of color existing without spatial extension. And you could, observe thousands of cases of color and find in each case spatial extension, but all you can really say is that up until now, we haven't found any case of unextended color. But Husserl says, look, it's clear that we understand with one stroke of the mind, without having to conduct lots of observations, without having to make elaborate inductions from them. With one stroke of the mind, we understand that color qualities and spatial extension are inseparable, that it's essentially impossible to have the quality without the spatial extension. Now, that may sound like an arcane point that Husserl's making, but there's something of tremendous significance here. There is a kind of restoration of philosophy in the face of the claim that only the natural sciences deliver real knowledge of the world. The point of Husserl is, no, there's another kind of knowing, different altogether from that proper to the natural sciences, whereby the human mind understands the very essence of a thing and understands what's essentially necessary and essentially impossible. And this is the domain of philosophy, this rational insight into the structures of things. This is what philosophy and philosophy alone can do. And so by beating back, you might say, these aggressive claims of the natural sciences, that their empirical methods alone reveal the law structure of the world, Husserl made place again for philosophy. You might say, to use our language of reduction, he showed that philosophy does a kind of knowing that is irreducible to the knowing proper to the natural sciences. This is, in a way, takes us back to our example of logic being reduced to psychology. You might say is a kind of instance of a larger reduction. The larger reductionism is that all knowledge that understands the structure and natures of things is an empirical knowledge of the kind of natural science. And so my fifth case of reduction and irreducibility is like an enlarged version of the case of logic being reduced to psychology. So that now gets expanded in the phenomenologist and in von Hildebrand. He made some very important contributions of his own to just how the mind achieves this rational insight into what is essentially necessary, and especially into the object. What kind of object lets us understand with, so to say, one stroke of the mind what is essentially necessary and essentially impossible. And I won't try to go into all of that. I just want to show that it was this resolute anti-reductionism of phenomenology that made it possible to recover philosophy as an eminent mode of knowing, all its own, irreducible to the knowing proper to the natural sciences. So one can speak, that's why von Hildebrand thought he saw a kind of new springtime of philosophy in Husserl. Because the very possibility of philosophy not being eaten up by the natural sciences, but making a contribution that only it can make, all turns on whether there really are essential necessities that really are knowable to the human mind. So let's maybe take some questions here on this before we proceed. It's maybe easy to overlook how important this anti-reductionism is, and why something as grand as the recovery of philosophy in an age of empiricism is really at stake. Yeah.
So Husserl says, in a flash, I know that no observations of color are going to be possible without extension. Yeah. Okay, and then the scientist comes back and says, well, how did you arrive at this essence of color?
Yeah.
So what? So.
Yeah. Well, you know, Husserl said, among many other things, that one excellent way of getting at the essence of a thing is to try to think the opposite. You see, so now with human beings, you can, think of human beings with 4 eyes and, quite differently constituted. It's possible. But you try to think of color qualities with no spatial extension, or melodies with no temporal extension. In that effort to think it, you see the impossibility. And so that would be, or von Hildebrand would say, try to think of some subpersonal being having real moral qualities. Well, as you think it through, you see, no, that can't be. And in that way, this essential necessity comes to evidence.
Well, what about the comeback you hear from quantum physicists? alternative universes. I
Yeah.
can think that.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, they do have a comeback sometimes.
Yeah.
They do that, like in
Right.
quantum physics, they'll come back with probability, and quantum
Yeah.
mechanics will come back
Well,
with
now-
alternate universes.
Yeah, now, you know, it's certainly not the view of Hildebrand or of Husserl or of any of the phenomenologists that this rational insight can replace the natural sciences. You see, so there are innumerable areas where, like in astronomy and the study of the formation of galaxies, where nothing but observation will do. And where a philosopher would make himself look foolish if he said, no, I understand with one stroke of the mind, that this galaxy contains so and so many stars. So a lot of subject matters available only to a sober scientific observation of the world. But in some areas, like the nature of truth, the nature of a valid argument, the nature of good and evil, the different moral vices, the nature of the human person. In some of these supremely important issues, we do have a subject matter amenable to this rational insight. And that's the glory of philosophy. Not to replace the natural sciences. That would then be, you might say, the same aggression that the natural sciences have been committing against philosophy, now turned against them. And, philosophy would expose itself to justified rebuke. It's in ethics, in aesthetics, in the philosophy of the person, in metaphysics, the things of essential necessity and essential impossibility. That is what phenomenology wanted to recover again for philosophy. You go ahead and follow up.
No, I'm just thinking with these. Imagine something. Does he get it like in St. Thomas? The beings of reason exist only.
Yeah.
As opposed to particular instances of being in the material world, and then.
Yeah. Now, beings of reason in St. Thomas, that's I think that is a special thing. It refers to things like the concept of nothing. It plays a role in our discourse, and it's called a being of reason. So that is maybe, but the point is certainly there are a lot of fabricated things. A lot of invented things, constructed things, where nobody should claim they hold together by essential necessity, where they've got something made and invented, written all over. And philosophy, well-disciplined philosophy, lets all that be and leaves the natural scientists with plenty of work to do. I think there was another. Please, Christopher.
I have a question from online who asks, Hans asks, how does this insight of Hildebrand relate to St. Thomas's intelligibility that is graspable?
Yeah, it's very akin to that. It is that grasp of intelligibility by way of a kind of abstraction is a thought in Thomas that is, let's say, a close cousin of this phenomenological idea of understanding the essential necessities and impossibilities of things. So, and he was aware of that. In fact, I wanted to come to that this point in phenomenology, this recovery of essential knowing, let's just call it to give it a short name, which somehow restores philosophy, it also opened the phenomenologist to the whole previous history of Western philosophy, ever since Plato. This essential understanding of things has been central to philosophy. And so phenomenology is not another modern philosophy that despises everything in ancient and medieval philosophy and thinks that serious philosophy began with Descartes. Not at all. Precisely this recovery of essential knowing made the phenomenologists feel their solidarity with Plato and Aristotle and important predecessors, all of whom grappled with this and gave some account of this essential necessity of things. So, yeah, please.
It seems on this point that Husserl and Hildebrand aren't so much even attacking a modern materialism, but kind of the Cartesian view of science, where they might say that yes, you might need a material leaf or something like that to perceive the color green, but a leaf in itself is not green, they would say.
Yeah.
It's the perception of it by kind of the logic of that it's elementary particles aren't colored. It's really just the ways we're perceiving or something like that. So that seems to attack this kind of the approach of to the things themselves, saying, well, this leaf isn't actually green. This thing is not green. It's our perception of that.
Yes, right. Well, now, on that question of color qualities, where there's an awful lot for more than one might think for philosophers to work on, von Hildebrand does think that the color qualities do somehow exist in relation to a perceiver, and that the heard sounds presuppose someone listening, and that they aren't like absolute things like substances, so that the color qualities are somehow co-constituted by our perceiving of the world in interaction with the light waves. But Hildebrand still thinks that even if the color qualities somehow presuppose a human perceiver, still, once they're constituted, they are things of great richness and abundance and meaningfulness, and therefore are not rightly debunked as subjective impressions. Yeah, please.
I would just like to add, meaning gets extracted in some instances, in some instances it isn't. So for instance, DNA is just a bunch of chemicals put together, but when they're in contact with other chemicals, specific chemicals, they extract that meaning that's in those chemicals, and you have a human person get developed. So, I mean, there's more to it than just particles.
Of course, that raises deep metaphysical questions, as to whether something like a person just emerges out of the DNA and the brain structure, or whether one has to assume some kind of intervention from the outside for something like a person, a center of freedom, to come into existence. Yeah, that. What else,
I have one
Christopher?
more question here from Jay Richardson, who asks.
From where?
From Jay Richardson. I'm not sure where he's from. He asks, though, that. Just scroll up for it. He asks, is it not the job of philosophy today to put the natural sciences, put them in their place within the context of logic as a whole, where the Cartesian attempt at bracketing things as res extensa is known to be but a tool and not ultimate reality?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think you're going to have to read it one more time for me to get a grip on that question.
Let me try to get it from the beginning. He would like to ask if it is not the task of philosophical work today to put the natural sciences in their place within the context of logic as a whole, where the Cartesian attempt at bracketing things as res extensa is known to be a tool and not ultimate reality. Well,
there he's referring to a certain deficiency of Descartes, and maybe not everybody here is up on Descartes' natural science, so I don't want to go into it too much. But the questioner, I think, aims at a certain interesting case of reductionism in Descartes. Namely, Descartes thought that all living beings were really just machines. He thought that life wasn't any kind of new principle, but that you could mechanistically explain all living things. And that's a classic piece of reductionism, to take the model of a machine and try to press a living organism into that model. So the phenomenologist will say against Descartes, no, life, the spontaneity, the power of life to propagate itself, that is something new vis-a-vis a machine, and irreducible to the machine. So that introduces yet another specimen of reductionism into our discussion. Yeah, I did want also to mention that as von Hildebrand was drawn back to the great tradition of Western philosophy, because especially through this recovery of the method and object of philosophy with essential necessity, he had a particular affinity with the tradition that runs from Plato through St. Augustine. You know, there's this oversimplified way of surveying Western philosophy, and we've got Aristotle and St. Thomas, and that tradition, and we have Plato and St. Augustine. But if I can use that oversimplification for a moment, I just want you to know, since I'm trying to place von Hildebrand within Western philosophy for you, that he had a particular affinity with the Augustinian tradition, and felt somehow at home in it. By the way, he's in good company in saying that, because Pope Benedict has more than once indicated that he understands himself more in the Augustinian than in the Thomistic tradition. And I think that at least part of the reason for this Augustinian side of von Hildebrand was that he had a particular respect for the way in which Augustine explained essential necessity and the mind's understanding of it. I'm not going to try to go into details of that, but that Augustinian way of rendering an account of essential necessity had a great appeal for von Hildebrand, and is at least part of the reason why, through his phenomenology, he became, in his own self-understanding, something of an Augustinian in his general philosophical approach. In any case, I hope that the fear that von Hildebrand, because of his roots in phenomenology, was infected with subjectivism, I trust that has been laid to rest by the way we've seen phenomenology here at work in these different forms of anti-reductionism. Yes?
Yes, Professor.
Sure.
Could you possibly elaborate a little bit on the connection with St. Augustine in light of the idea that perhaps if we can look at Descartes, Descartes may have been trying to rely on something like Augustine's perspective to recover the dignity of philosophy in light of his time. If we could say that Descartes, in some sense, remembered Augustine, but not the anti-Pelagian aspect of it, and that phenomenology has been going back and trying to go back to the, not to the Cartesian cogito, but so much to the cogito of the Confessions.
Yes.
To the subjectivity of an inner dialogue that we find in some philosophers, even in the I-thou perspective. Where do you think Husserl would fall with respect to that kind of a claim? Where do you think von Hildebrand would fall with respect to a claim that phenomenology is essentially, in some sense, Augustinian?
Yeah, that's, efforts have also been made, like by Karol Wojtyła, to connect phenomenology and the Thomistic tradition. Edith Stein made significant attempts in that direction. And whether phenomenology is inherently more Augustinian than Thomistic, I would hesitate to say. What I'd really rather point out is that phenomenology, it opens itself gratefully to both the Augustinian and the Thomistic tradition by virtue of this recovery of essential understanding. And by the way, you bring in Descartes. Von Hildebrand was not as violently anti-Cartesian as many Christian philosophers are, because he read him in an Augustinian vein. He saw certain Augustinian themes, often in a lopsided way, but still somehow reviving in Descartes. And he had a mixed assessment, but not this unqualified hostility to Descartes that is you find among some even Catholic philosophers. Yeah, please, Christopher.
I have another question from a viewer asks, following up on this, could you speak a little bit more on von Hildebrand's view towards St. Thomas and Thomism?
Yeah. Well, that's a complex issue. I think the safest thing for me is to be a little bit evasive here and say, in our next meeting, when we discuss von Hildebrand's moral philosophy, I will have a good opportunity to point to some differences between von Hildebrand and the Thomistic approach to the moral life. So let's say that, tell this viewer that he or she definitely needs to come back to our meeting, which is not tomorrow but continues on Wednesday, and I'll look at some points of discrepancy there between von Hildebrand and Aquinas with regard to some fundamental issues of ethics. Let's see, were there more questions here on? Please.
I mean, that this insight of Hildebrand, does it still rely on the conviction that what Descartes was saying about this malicious spirit, that we have to trust, but we are not aligned into believing that this impression that we have about the extensionality, for example, of color or sound, that this is so in reality as opposed to being a limit of our mind still. So is this somehow challenged at all? Or?
Well, no, she's asking here about the famous spiritus malignus, this evil genius that Descartes brings up as a kind of thought experiment, a being who would have unlimited power of deceiving me. And so Descartes wonders, if there is such a powerful deceiver at work on my mind, can I know anything at all? And von Hildebrand, as Descartes, often points out that the insight into essential necessity is so powerful. There's so much rational light in that in the moment when we understand that, for instance, only persons can be morally good or bad, we can be sure that we are not in the grip of this deceiving spirit. Whatever he might conjure up in the way of delusions and fantasies, and he still can't mislead us when we understand the essential impossibility of something, or understand that contradictory propositions can't both be true, for instance. That understanding is so powerful in its rationality that it is an assurance that, at least in this point, we're not under the spell of that malignant spirit. This is a knowledge with such a guarantee of certainty and of being in touch with the very structures that it becomes an argument against the unlimited power of that evil spirit. That's all part of the Hildebrandian unpacking of this intriguing idea of essential necessity. And we'll see in the next meeting on his moral philosophy many further instances of such rational insight in his ethics. All right. Now, Christopher, you look like you've got
I do. I just got
question.
a very good question from
right.
Dan Hoffman, who asks, is there a need to go through a verification process in essential knowing? One may know that color and special extension are inseparable, but must continuously experience it to make it more knowable. One must.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, if by verify you mean conduct careful observations in the spirit of natural science, then one has to say no. Further verification would be superfluous. So obviously there's some experiential basis of understanding that color qualities have to be extended in space. Something is given to me in experience, but von Hildebrand says it's an essential structure. There's the essential form, so to say, of space and color. That's what lets me understand essential necessity. And so that kind of experience is necessary even for the philosopher. But, as he says, and already Husserl said, in a way it doesn't even matter whether the particular example of color that you're looking at is real or hallucinated. In either case, it works just as well to give you this insight into the connection between color qualities and spatial extension. So, well-founded, carefully measured experiments of concrete instances of color perception would not be part of this understanding. Well, there's one final point I wanted to bring up. And it's not exactly a case of reductionism, but it's something like that. It's a case where von Hildebrand makes his phenomenological way of philosophizing fruitful for understanding his own Judeo-Christian tradition. So here he's not so much in debate with aggressive reductionists, but he is consulting the things themselves and gaining a new understanding of great value for his fellow believers. But the point is not a point of faith, as you'll see. I'm referring to something for which von Hildebrand is very well known, and that is for his understanding of the so-called dual meaning of the conjugal act. Now, what I mean by dual meaning is this. For many centuries, the conjugal act was seen primarily in terms of its procreative power. And in fact, that procreative aspect of the conjugal act was so strongly and so exclusively affirmed that some church fathers, including Augustine and St. Ambrose, thought that conjugal relations were venially sinful if performed at a time when the spouses know there's no possibility of procreation. So during pregnancy or after menopause. So that expresses the understanding of the conjugal act as having its whole raison d'etre in procreation. Now, von Hildebrand was one of the first Christian thinkers to call attention to the conjugal act as an enactment of conjugal love. He was one of the first to notice that a certain self-giving of the spouses one to another is enacted in a unique bodily way in conjugal relations. And this is a distinct dimension from the procreative. Now, you know, many of you, how the Vatican Council took over and ratified this understanding of conjugal act having this dual meaning, the procreative, but also the enactment of spousal love meaning as well. But when one looks into the earlier part of this century, according to some scholars, Dietrich von Hildebrand was the first Christian thinker who discerned over and above the procreative, which he never put into question, also this enactment of conjugal love through the marital intimacy of the couple. And what I want to suggest to you is that this insight of von Hildebrand's is a fruit of his phenomenological openness to the things themselves. It comes from this resolute way of philosophizing that brings things to evidence and doesn't see one thing but at the expense of something else. So, as I say, there's not exactly a reductionism here. It's simply that for centuries the procreative meaning of the conjugal act was so strongly seen that nothing else was seen. And it was definitely an important acquisition for Christian self-understanding, that this love dimension, this enactment of spousal self-donation through the body would also be seen. And so a philosopher trained in letting things show themselves for what they are, in seeing to it that one thing doesn't block the view of another, is ideally prepared to make a contribution like this one that von Hildebrand made. And this contribution of his also is connected with what I call his personalism, because obviously you gain a more personalist view of the conjugal act when you think of it not only as nature's instrument for propagating the species, but also as an act in which the spouses enact or actualize in a unique way their spousal commitment to each other. So that by retrieving that enactment of love dimension, a personalist aspect of marital intimacy was brought to consciousness. Obviously it wasn't unknown for all these centuries, but at the level of a certain official consciousness, at the level of a certain standard teaching, it was all about procreation, and it was von Hildebrand, I suggest, empowered by his phenomenological sensitivity, who made this contribution that has played such a large role in the Christian understanding of marriage. And of course, he quite realizes that married love was always connected with marriage, the community of marriage. It's the connection with the conjugal act. That was the originality of von Hildebrand. And that, as I say, is the uncovering of something, as it were, long hidden, the disclosure of something that had been in the shadow of something else. So there is something distinctly phenomenological about that well-known insight of his into human sexuality. So that's the last main point here in the presentation, and surely if that doesn't stir up some discussion, nothing will. Yes, Dr. Rice.
Just a quick question. First of all, I'm tempted, recalling von Hildebrand's, speaking of the unitive and procreative meanings of the act, to see again a recovery of St. Augustine to some extent, although with Augustine the meaning concupiscencia. But how far does von Hildebrand ever get in reducing, if you will, the dual meaning of the act, perhaps to one unified meaning of one unified act? Is it, does he stay at the level of one act with two distinct meanings that that aren't really, while they may be related, they're not ever understandable as one? Or do we ever get to a point where we can understand the unitive and procreative as constituents of a single meaning?
Yes, yeah. Yeah, no, I think that he definitely thought of these two meanings as tied together by intrinsic bonds. And you can find in him already the idea that is well known in John Paul, that when one deliberately sterilizes the procreative potential of the marital act, one compromises the self-giving dimension of it. So in that sense, they're tied together, and you can't just abolish the one and keep the other fully intact. On the other hand, for von Hildebrand, it does make sense at a time, let's say, when the married man and woman know that there's no possibility of pregnancy and of procreation, that their one flesh unity have a full meaning as expressing their love. You see, that idea missing in Augustine, who thinks that it's venially sinful,
Yes.
In the absence of possible procreation. He thinks there's, given his account, abundant meaning, justifying, making deep personalist sense out of marital intimacy.
Because John Paul would go even further, I think, and say that the act, even in a couple, a married couple that is sterile, for example, that there's something essentially procreative about the conjugal act when it's authentically lived in intention. And I'm wondering to what extent is the procreation in von Hildebrand a procreation of intention as well as a procreation of fact?
Yeah, I think probably one should say John Paul went farther in that direction than Hildebrand does. Yeah. Yeah, Chris.
On this point, Justin from Oxford asks,
Yeah.
would Hildebrand have said that his insight into the unitive meaning of the conjugal act was an insight into an essential necessity, akin to the essential necessities of color and extension?
Yeah, there's a very probing question from Justin in Oxford. This power of the marital intimacy to enact spousal self-giving, is that a thing of essential necessity? Now, for von Hildebrand, the basis for this exalted view of the conjugal act is a certain view of human sexuality. Namely, he argues right at the beginning of his beautiful book on purity that in man, sexuality has a completely different position than any other bodily appetite, because the sexual energy of a man and woman is intimately tied to the, the sexual energy has a certain personal intimacy to it, and therefore is fit for personal self-disclosure and self-giving. If it were just another bodily drive, like hunger and thirst, it wouldn't have this capacity for self-giving. So he thinks there is a mysterious dimension of personal intimacy written into the sexual energy of man and woman. And the question that Justin is asking is that a matter of essential necessity? It's certainly something very meaningful, but is it a matter of, is it like essentially impossible and absurd for sexual energy in a person not to have that intimacy and that connection with self-giving? Perhaps so. It's, let me just let the question stand, and let me just pose it. Is this this fact that, like von Hildebrand says, the sexual character of a person is somehow tied to the secret of each person, hence this intimacy. And that's why sexual self-disclosure can be so desecrating for a person if it's done in an irresponsible way, but also can enact the self-giving. Are we here in the domain of essential necessity, where it would be impossible for something like sexuality not to have that deep personal depth? Or is that, could we say, a meaningful part of God's creation that could have been different, but is a very meaningful thing, that this sexual energy be rooted in the intimate secret of each person, and therefore destined for either self-desecration or self-donation. I'm wavering between a meaningful divine creation or something of essential necessity. So that's, Justin's going to have to, Justin is a former student of mine, so tell him that I'm hoping he'll also work on this very question. Yeah, please.
It seems that maybe one of the interesting avenues to kind of go from that question is asking about sexual differentiation between male and female, and whether actual male and femaleness is essential rather than accidental to being a human being. And it seems that if it's something essential, then there might be a way of talking about this essential necessity. And he mentioned that aspect of bringing like color to matter. And maybe there's a analogous relationship between being a human being and either being male or female, and kind of not really a non-existent kind of. It might be non-existent to say a sexless human being. And I'm wondering if maybe there's a connection between that. Of course, there's that category of that are both male.
You're following up on Justin's
but it seems
question.
I think that's something that maybe like Edith Stein and some other people talked about is, and Carol Wojtyła talking about that sexuality is something essential rather than just merely accidental.
Yes. Well, it's certainly not accidental in the sense that it could just as well be otherwise. And especially Wojtyła has these beautiful reflections on the way in which the man-woman difference images God, and images in particular the Trinitarian God. And that image would be lost. We had unisex human beings. So the profound meaningfulness, the theological richness of it is all granted. But I do still want to, and von Hildebrand did too, leave a space for this realm of things that maybe in some absolute sense could have been otherwise, but as created by God are eminently meaningful.
It seems to me
so that the meaning would be squandered if they were otherwise.
Yeah, maybe in the use of essential and accidental, it's more of an optimistic understanding. And that's might be a bone to pick with even some Thomas saying that sexuality is something that might, I'm not sure the depths of that, but it might not, sexuality is not the same level of essence as simply the species of being human. And maybe there's a way that maybe it could be. I don't know.
No, that Edith Stein, as you mentioned, has a lot of very significant things to say on this question, and very profound things about the fact that the man-woman difference is not just a bodily difference, but that it extends through the psyche into the very structure of the person, this man-woman difference. A view entirely congenial to von Hildebrand. Yeah, so if I were to try to summarize today's meeting, the place of von Hildebrand in Western philosophy, then I would say, well, we started with von Hildebrand as phenomenologists, and saw what phenomenology means. It means a particular way of being attuned to the abundance of being, and a particular aversion to patterns of thought, reductionistic, but not only reductionistic patterns, that can cut us off from that abundance and block the view of significant dimensions of being. So we also saw that through his phenomenological orientation, he found a path into the great tradition of Western philosophy, and especially the Augustinian tradition. And I might also add, just by way of summary, that this phenomenological orientation in von Hildebrand is quite central to the personalism for which he is known. And with that, I would try to bring to a conclusion today's attempt to get at the philosophical style of von Hildebrand and his general relation to other philosophers, and we will then come come Wednesday at the same time, 3 o'clock, look into his moral philosophy. That's the area in which he did most of his philosophical work, in moral philosophy. There's some very significant and original things there I'd like to discuss with you. And that question about Aquinas and von Hildebrand will find its place in the setting of our meeting. I think I have it titled Von Hildebrand and the Renewal of Moral Philosophy. That will be our focus on Wednesday. Well, I thank you for your endurance. AC and 2.5 hours. Thank you very much for your presence and participation. And I look forward to continuing on Wednesday and Thursday.